I have to tell you, in 15 years reporting the news on the radio, I've never seen events so out of control and surreal. Madness has taken control of much of the world. Clare Lopez is on the telephone. She is a 20-year veteran of the CIA as a special operations manager for the agency. She is presently vice president for research and analysis for the Center for Security Policy in Washington. Claire, has the world gone insane in the summer of 2014?
No, not at all.
This is normal? This is normal?
Yes, actually, I wouldn't call it normal, but I would call it average. For anybody who really looks at the history of Islam from the 7th century through to the current date, this is much more the norm than perhaps some of the years of our lifetimes, yours, mine, and our listeners perhaps, when Islam had been suppressed for a brief hiatus of time. But throughout much of the rest of those 1,300 plus years between the 7th century and now, this is very much the norm. But because people don't know their history, they don't understand what is going on, they don't understand what Islam or jihad is, they think that somehow this is a new event, something new and startling. It's certainly startling, but it's not new.
So the spirit of Islam that was contained by Spain 500 years ago, that spirit is loose again.
Well, Islamic jihad, of course, is an obligation for all Muslims for all time until the world is subjugated to Sharia. And so at any time and place when the forces of Islam are capable of mounting jihad, they do so. The only time that they don't do so is when they are forcibly suppressed. And one might look at the colonial period when British, French, and others occupied great parts of what's called the Muslim world or the Middle East and beyond, eastwards all the way into Asia. You can look at the early part of the 20th century when world wars and tumult and followed by the Cold War also likewise served to suppress Islamic jihad. But once those conditions ended, those wars ended, those conditions ended, naturally jihad burst forth again. And it is unfortunately not only not understood, but because it is not understood, it is not acknowledged or confronted. And we're in the situation we're in today.
Claire, what do you say to people in government and the media who say that Islam is a peaceful religion and these terrorists have, quote, hijacked a peaceful religion?
Well, I guess I would have to recommend that they do a little bit of homework, beginning with some of the history that I just recounted. But the other thing they're going to have to do is to actually go to the sources of Islamic doctrine and law, and that would be, of course, the Quran. They would have to read the hadiths, which are the doings, the activities, and the sayings of Muhammad. They would have to read Sharia, which is Islamic law, all of which I have done. And they would have to understand that the doctrine commands this behavior. Now, do all 1.6 billion Muslims on earth follow the laws of their own faith? Of course not, any more than Christians do, or Jews do, or anybody else. One can certainly think of many Christians who don't obey the Ten Commandments, go to church regularly on Sunday, and so forth.
So what we need are more...
Thankfully, there are a lot of more disobedient Muslims. May they prosper and multiply.
That's what I was going to say. What we need are more backslidden Muslims. Because if they're reading their Quran and practicing their faith, they're going to be cutting off heads.
Exactly. That is what they are commanded to do as faithful Muslims, as devout and practicing, actively engaged practicing Muslims. But, of course, the vast majority of Muslims, and certainly Muslims in the United States, don't want anything to do with cutting off heads. They have their lives, they have their jobs, they have their children, and that's what they're engaged with. That's what they're paying attention to. But even by passively not condemning vocally out loud what is going on, the major Muslim organizations and leadership figures in the United States and elsewhere in the West are tacitly supporting what is going on. When they pay zakat, which is the obligatory annual tax on all Muslims and all Muslim companies, they are contributing to jihad, because by law, 1/8 of all zakat must go to jihad. It's not charity. Zakat is an annual tax, 1/8 of which goes to jihad. When they speak, when they write.
Is this tax collected in the United States in the mosque?
Yes, absolutely it is. It is collected through the mosques. It is also collected through various of these major mainline and many of the Muslim Brotherhood front organizations like Islamic Society of North America, Council on American Islamic Relations, otherwise known as CARE, ICNA, Islamic Circle of North America, and many others. There are online buttons or tabs when you go to these websites, these homepages, that say, make your donation here. Your donation is zakat eligible. That money goes to zakat, and 1/8 of that goes to jihad.
Who decides where that money goes?
If we're talking in terms of a company, the company would have a board of advisors, and those advisors would be recognized authorities, clerics, Muslim clerics, who would divvy up the annual tax for that company and send it off to wherever it's supposed to go. If it is an individual and it goes through an organization or into the drop box, little collection boxes inside of mosques, it would be the authority of the mosque that does that sending of the funds and deciding where it goes to. But it's all done by authorities with the responsibility of divvying up, apportioning the zakat.
Claire, the 1/8 that is dedicated to jihad, how is it transmitted out of the United States, and where does it go?
Well, there are all kinds of cutouts, of course. There are layers and layers of intermediary organizations, many of them disguised as quote-unquote charities. You'll all remember, of course, the 2008 case called the Holy Land Foundation Hamas terror funding trial. Well, Holy Land Foundation was one of these types of cutouts. It posed as a non-profit organization, collected millions and millions of dollars, supposedly for charity, but it channeled that money ultimately to Hamas, and that's what it was prosecuted for and convicted for. And there are likewise many other organizations like that, which pose as charitable organizations, and they go from one to the next in a little bit of a shell game, and ultimately through some banking facility, and off you go.
Claire, when I started this radio show in Dallas-Fort Worth, 1999, I openly talked about the Holy Land Foundation, that it was a money laundering operation for terrorism. And I was followed around in Dallas-Fort Worth by Muslim men, and I would speak in public. There would be, 6 to 10 Muslim men in the audience taking notes. I knew they were very aware who I was and what I was saying. That was 1999. And, seemed like there was nobody in law enforcement who was taking it seriously. The threat of Holy Land Foundation and other groups inside the United States. Okay, if Christian churches in the United States collected their tithes and offerings, and the pastor told the congregation, 1/8 of your tithe will be sent to a violence fund, and where we will use the money to blow up buildings and kill people and behead people, how long would that be allowed to go on in the United States?
Well, it's not necessarily what goes on inside the mosques either. It's not that they tell people your money is going to go to blow up people and buildings and buses full of children. They don't tell them that. And if the donors, the faithful, the congregation, aren't diligent in their own homework or their own understanding of Islam and what zakat is and other tenets of Islam, they won't be aware of it either, and many of them genuinely believe that they are donating to a charitable cause.
But the clerics know where the money's going.
Sure they do.
Okay, that's my point. If the clerics know where it's going and they're transferring the money out of the United States knowing that it's going for violence, why is this permitted?
Well, it's very difficult to track. Certainly the Treasury Department would be on top of as much as they could be. That's how the entire Holy Land Foundation case came to trial and was prosecuted successfully. But unfortunately, for instance, the follow-on trials which were to have followed after the Holy Land Foundation trial and to prosecute all the remaining several hundreds of unindicted co-conspirators, among them many of these Muslim Brotherhood front groups that I've just named before. That was all stopped when the current administration came in, and Eric Holder, Attorney General, announced in 2010 that there would just not be any further prosecutions.
Clare, I'd like to hear your opinion about these very dire warnings by some very prominent people. Lieutenant General Thomas McInerney, who you personally know and work with, told Fox News that the U.S. should go to DEFCON 1 in preparation of a possible 9/11-14 event. Former CIA Deputy Director Mike Morrell told CBS that we should be worrying about a 9/11 event. Homeland Security Chairman Michael McCall said ISIS has operations currently underway to strike Western targets. General Dempsey saying today that once he determines ISIS is a threat to the United States homeland, he will recommend military operations. Do these men know something that the rest of us don't know?
Well, I think they're right to be concerned, and naturally they're looking at the 9/11 date coming up again in just a couple of weeks, and remembering how unprepared we were on the first one, how unprepared we obviously were in Benghazi in 2012, and they know that IS is a serious and growing power in the region of what used to be called Syria and Iraq, and that the leadership of IS, Islamic State, have made explicit statements of threat against the West, against the United States. So, it's right to be concerned and prepared. But for the moment, IS really is a regional phenomenon. It is engaged in expanding its territory there in the Middle East. It is trying to govern the land that it's already taken over, and it indeed is governing. It is forming an administration that does everything, including building clinics, moving traffic, and collecting taxes. It's doing all of that, administering justice. That would be Islamic law, Sharia justice. But for the moment, the most that we know is that they do not have an international capability. Now, that said, one thing that's been noted with a lot of concern, and rightfully so, is that there are literally thousands of Muslim jihadis, Muslim fighters, who've gone from Western countries, from Canada, the U.S., Australia, Western European countries, to what used to be Syria and Iraq to fight in the jihad. And they carry passports that allow them, in many cases, to cross borders without visas, including into and out of our own country. And so the danger that some of these will come back to the countries where they're from and mount individual jihad attacks has got to be taken very seriously. We've already seen what happened with at least one jihadi, a Briton, now identified, who has been accused of being the one who beheaded American journalist Jim Foley. Some states, like Australia, are acting preemptively, and Prime Minister Tony Abbott, to his credit, has announced that any Australian citizen who goes off to fight jihad will not be permitted back in the country. Citizenship is considered revoked when the individual joins a foreign hostile military force, as it should be. Netherlands is another one that is beginning to implement restrictions on the travel of citizens who intend to take their Dutch passports and go off to fight jihad. They're acting even more preemptively and canceling the passports and the citizenship of those whose motives are identified ahead of time, ahead of their travel. So, gradually some of these countries are waking up, but not the United States, not yet.
Yeah, Nigel Farage in Great Britain is also recommending the same policy. Clare?
Yes, I should have mentioned them too, yeah.
All right, but to be perfectly blunt, the Obama administration trained and armed jihadists to fight the Syrian government, and the Obama administration deliberately decided not to enforce the U.S. border at Mexico. I'm not going along with this script. I mean, we got two things going on here. The U.S. government, part of the U.S. government, is training and arming jihadists. We now are on the side of Al-Qaeda. And at the same time, the administration in Washington is deliberately not providing security at the southern border. We all know where this is going.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in addition to these passport holders who don't even have to come across an unguarded southern border, it's perfectly reasonable to expect that many others will take advantage of that collapsed southern border of ours and come across in the general flow of illegals that are being permitted into the country right now, and then allowed to stay, and then provided all kinds of welfare and support, and then given lawyers, and then ultimately given amnesty. So we have to expect that there will be some among that flow. We don't know it for a fact right now, but it's reasonable to expect that's what's happening. And then, of course, yes, you're right. The Obama administration very clearly has switched sides in the war on terror, what used to be called the war on terror, and we have provided arms and intelligence and funding and assistance and NATO warplanes to help Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood. I think this administration came into office with an agenda to withdraw American power and influence from Muslim lands in particular. And that meant specifically, of course, withdrawing from Afghanistan and Iraq, which we did with predictable results. The Taliban will own Afghanistan shortly, and Iraq immediately fell under the hegemony of Iran, the Iranian Tehran regime of the mullahs. But now IS is a bit of a fly in the ointment because that region of the Middle East was designated, I think, by our administration for Iranian hegemony, Shiite hegemony. The Sunnis got theirs. Theirs was to be North Africa. But IS is Sunni, and IS is running rampant across these regions right now, regions that are supposed to be designated for Iranian Shiite hegemony. But I'm keeping an eye on Iran and the Tehran regime because I can well recall the close terrorist operational relationship between Iran and Al-Qaeda that dates back to the early 1990s and brought us 9/11, of course, along with the help of Saudi Arabia, but IS doesn't have that backing anymore. But I am watching Iran. I don't see Iran mounting an army to go in and decimate IS. I see it guarding the Shiite shrines, making sure that its puppet regime in Baghdad doesn't fall, that the Shiite south of Iraq, with all its lovely oil, remains in Shiite hands. But I don't see an aggressive effort to decimate the Islamic State. I also don't see the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the 57-member head of state organization of all Muslim countries in the world, 56 of them plus the Palestinians makes 57 members. I don't see them raising an army. I don't see the states that have received all those gazillions of dollars of U.S. top-of-the-line equipment, military equipment and weapons over the past decades. I don't see them putting all that weaponry to decimating the so terribly un-Islamic Islamic State. So I'm keeping an eye on all of that, I would say.
Claire, last question. I don't buy the explanation by a lot of conservatives that Barack Obama is an inept, incompetent, socialist progressive buffoon with bad policies. I've come to the conclusion he is a jihadist who is carrying out jihad against the United States. Have you considered the possibility that we have a jihadist in the White House?
Well, he's certainly enabling the forces of Islam to rise again and to take over regions of the world that were not in the jihad column before he came to office. He has absolutely enabled that. I think his speech in Cairo in June 2009 was the green light for that to happen. And I think he signaled in that speech that when Islam rose up again, jihad rose up again, the United States would not only not stand in its way, it would facilitate it. And that's what we've done. That's what our leadership has done, not we.
Well, that sounds like he's a jihadist to me. And why Washington is looking the other way, I can't comprehend. I can't even come up with an answer. Everything's become surreal. And it's a very, very bizarre time to be alive and watching this happen. My guest, Clare Lopez, Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Center for Security Policy in Washington. Thank you, Clare. Appreciate you being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, you're listening to True News. I'm Rick Wiles.